On Friday, Justice John Paul Stevens announced his decision to retire after 34 years from the Supreme Court. Now, President Obama has the opportunity to appoint his second justice. Who's he likely to pick? Well, some, like Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, are urging Obama to pick someone who will be cautious, be persuasive, not trigger an epic fight. Pragmatism sounds smart, given the split in the Senate, but is a cautious choice necessarily best? It may come down to the lessons learned from the healthcare debate. Negotiate first, fight later, or fight first, knowing concessions will mount. No matter what, the court appointment process is very different from what it was when Stevens joined the bench. To kick off, here's Senator Schumer speaking this weekend.
In my view, at least, Justice Roberts has tried to move the court very far to the right, much further than we ever envisioned. I think Justice Stevens felt that in some of the opinions, dissents that he rendered. And he's been able to get Justice Kennedy to go along with some of those. So my view would be I'd like the new nominee to be one of 5, not one of 4 when the votes come up, and somebody who would be quite persuasive in terms of influencing other justices, I guess particularly Justice Kennedy.
Well, what do you think? I'd love to hear. You can email me, Laura@GRITtv.org, and we'll look at your comments later in the week. Here to kick off the conversation in studio is Elizabeth Holtzman, former 2-term congressman from New York, also former DA from Brooklyn. Elizabeth, welcome back to Grit TV.
Thanks.
First off, the Stevens legacy. On many, many questions, whether it's civil liberties, wiretapping, Guantanamo, there are many who say, where would we have been without him all these years?
Right. I actually encountered him, I wouldn't say personally, but through my office when I was district attorney, and we were leading the fight in the United States to stop the practice of having prosecutors, I was a prosecutor, remove blacks from the jury solely because of race. And we won a great Supreme Court case, and he was the author of it. And I think he was in the tradition, great tradition, of fair-minded, moderate justices, primarily Republican justices. You can think of Earl Warren, but Stevens falls in that pattern, of justices who didn't come to the court with an ideological predisposition. They came as fair-minded and as human beings, and they weren't trying to advance an ideological agenda. They looked at the situation in the country, they looked at the cases in front of them, and they produced impressive rulings.
One of the remarkable things about Stevens is that he even changed his opinion on critical, huge issues like the death penalty, and visibly so.
Well, so did Justice Blackmun. And I think that was really a hallmark. People came, they had some ideas, but they weren't exposed. You know, some people lead very sheltered lives as lawyers, even as judges, and they weren't exposed to the vast issues that really affect the American people. And I think it's important to be able to grow, as opposed to being a complete ideologue. And I think that's the sad quality that we've seen in too many of the recent appointments. I mean, Justice Alito, Justice Roberts, Clarence Thomas, who basically follows whatever Scalia says. You don't have a sense of independence.
Well, what happened? I mean, you have Justice Stevens saying in an interview a few years back, every court appointment since, I think, 1971 has been more conservative than the person that he preceded, or she. Why? What happened? Has the right just gotten better at fighting than everybody else?
Well, I think what happened is that the right understood that it was the U.S. Supreme Court that ended the disgraceful history of segregation in America. And they've been fighting that ever since. And they realized that they had to replace the judges because it was the Supreme Court, the Warren Court, a Republican court, or at least the Chief Justice was a Republican, that changed that whole despicable past. And they knew that unless they did something about the courts, this was going to change in other ways. The Constitution would be read in a more humane and a broader way.
So what do you make of the names that have been brought up so far to replace Justice Stevens?
Well, I agree with Chuck Schumer. I think he made a very important point. How are we going to persuade Justice Kennedy? And I think ever since Sandra Day O'Connor left the court, Kennedy has found his home with the extreme right. When she was on the court, she moved him into what I consider to be the fair-minded position. And remember, she's a very conservative person, too. And so, in a way, the most persuasive person I can think of to come back to be nominated, if you're talking about getting Kennedy, is to nominate Sandra Day O'Connor. Much as I disagree with some of her rulings, I think the quality she brings of sincerity and thoughtfulness, and also bringing him along, I think that would be a home run, and you get that through the Senate.
So wait, appoint who?
Sandra Day O'Connor.
You can't appoint Sandra Day O'Connor at this point.
Why not?
Well, the point being that there is a gap to fill here.
Correct.
And the candidates that are being mentioned, I mean, a lot of people are saying that there is an opportunity here to really move the court into a new place, not just reconfigure existing.
Well, but the point is you can have a brilliant justice, and I think it's the point Senator Schumer was making, with which I agree. You can have a brilliant justice on that court, but you're still going to have 4 votes in the end. Because if that person is unable to persuade Justice Kennedy to leave the extreme right-wing justices and look at what the Constitution really says and look at the cases in front of him, then it's going to be 5-4 and 5-4 and 5-4. So you'll have a very brilliant justice, but we need a justice who can persuade Kennedy. I believe if we want to have the court not go down this extreme right-wing path, but go down a proper path. I mean, the case on campaign finance is an outrage. And Justice O'Connor, who's extremely conservative, was appointed by Ronald Reagan, is outraged at that decision. Well, if she were on the court, she would have voted the right way if she replaced Stevens, but she might have also been able to bring Kennedy along. That's the difference. Now, it's possible that some other nominees may have the same qualities, but we know she's been able to do that in the past. So that's my concern.
That's your choice. What about what you're hearing from the right, that this is an opportunity to have a major discussion about the Constitution? Here's what Bill Kristol had to say this week.
I think, for example, Kagan would be a very respectable choice, but nonetheless, I think most Republicans would oppose her, and honestly should oppose her, with respect and with deference to her, impressive academic credentials, because she will be a reliable liberal vote, and I think Republicans should want to have a serious debate on the Constitution. I'm struck when you listen to the Tea Party activists. They often talk about we need to be constitutionalists. We need to be constitutional conservatives. I think Michelle Bachmann used that phrase in talking with you just a couple of minutes ago. And I think having one thing that motivates conservatives today is the sense that the Constitution has just become a nothing.
Is that what we're about to go into, a big constitutional fight?
Well, I think the point is, what does the Constitution say and who views it? I mean, his view of the Constitution and my view of the Constitution are completely different. I mean, we just had a Supreme Court by a 5-4 vote say that corporations, for the first time in the history of America, can contribute in political elections. That's really a radical step away from the past. He thinks it's constitutional. I don't. So whose Constitution are we talking about and who's interpreting it? I mean, sure, it's always wonderful to have the Constitution discussed. It's a very important document. It has helped to preserve our liberties. In some cases, it became an excuse for abuses of power, but on the whole, it's preserved us as a democracy for a very long time. And sure, debate is good, but the issue is not going to be a fair-minded debate. It's going to be right versus left.
But it goes back to the right is pushing a very big agenda, a very
Correct.
Big idea. What you're saying the Democrats should do and the White House should do is bring in somebody who can play with the cards as they're dealt right now and just try to tip them in the right direction.
That would be a lot. If we could do that, that would be great.
Elizabeth Holtzman, thanks so much for joining us. There are links to Elizabeth Holtzman's books and her work at our website, GRITtv.org.